Good morning, everyone. This is the second video for Thursday, 12th of November. We're going to continue talking about infectious diseases and pathogenesis. So, next question that arises is, how do microbes actually cause disease? And this is somewhat analogous to sort of the viral life cycle we talked about earlier in the class in this cycle of infection. So the first thing a pathogen has to do is gain entry to the host, just like a virus has to get into the host cell. So somehow the pathogen has to attach and invade either specific cells. That's usually a virus in that case, but sometimes there are bacteria that actually invade host cells as well. Or sort of bigger picture, they just have to be able to attach and invade particular tissues. That could be on the outside of the body, the skin, or it could be internal through the GI tract, coming through the mouth and infecting somewhere along the way, usually in the intestines, or being inhaled into the respiratory tract, or in the genitourinary tract, or opportunistic pathogens. Often the tissue is just wherever they find themselves through, for example, a wound or damage to the body. Once they're there, of course, they want to start growing. They want to obtain nutrients from the host, but they have to, in order to do that, be able to evade the host defenses. Pretty much all aspects of our body have strategies for protecting themselves from microbes, from physical and chemical defenses that we'll get to early next week, to immunological defenses. Okay, so at the same time as the pathogen is trying to acquire nutrients and proliferate, the host is trying to keep it from doing that. Then ultimately, in order to be successful in sort of the evolutionary sense as a pathogen, not just in the context of that individual infection, the pathogen has to somehow get to new hosts, has to exit the host that it's in and attack a new one. So for us, from our perspective, the problem is that cellular and tissue damage often occurs as a result of these processes, and it's caused by the actions of the pathogen in causing the disease. So all of these elements of virulence, all these components of sort of the pathogenic life cycle have examples, and we won't go into all of these, although I would like you to read over these to see examples of how viruses accomplish each of these things. This is a lot of what we already talked about with viruses. You know that viruses have specific receptors that bind to host cells to mediate their entry. Bacteria, we haven't talked a lot about yet, but pili, for example, and other cell surface proteins can serve as adhesins for binding to host tissues. And then in the case of eukaryotic microbes, these are all unicellular parasites, Giardia, Trypanosoma, Plasmodium, the cause of malaria. And this is I believe this is a pathogenic yeast. But at any rate, there are examples for all of them of binding, evading host defenses, obtaining nutrients in order to grow, and causing cellular damage. This obtaining nutrients is a little different in the context of viruses. It's just basically how they take over the host cell so that they can propagate themselves. All right, so think about routes of transmission. This is basically how pathogens get in and out of a host cell. So physical contact is an obvious example. direct physical contact between the infected person, since that's what we're talking about here, although this could be anything, animal, plant, whatever. So physical contact between an organism that's infected with a pathogen and one that is susceptible, that allows that pathogen to move from one to the other. And sexual transmission is sort of a special subset of this route of contact-based transmission. Then there's indirect contact-based transmission, where the pathogen from one host is sort of contaminates something that came from that host, and then the intermediary object, the new host comes into contact with that, and the transmission is that way. That would be, for example, like coughing on your hand, and well, that's not a great example. Well, sure, coughing on your hand and then using it to open a doorknob, and then somebody else comes along and opens that same doorknob, or a faucet in a bathroom or something. So there are lots of examples of indirect transmission. It's something we worry about a bit for COVID-19. This is why hygiene is particularly important, but it's not the major route of transmission. Fecal oral is primarily GI tract pathogens, where they exit the body of the infected person in the feces, and then somebody else either directly comes in contact with that, or it gets into the water supply and the pathogens are there, or something like so typically this would come from either eating fecally contaminated food, or drinking contaminated water, whether intentionally or unintentionally, like bathing, for example, in contaminated water, and it gets into your mouth. So this is, as I said, this is pretty much for GI tract pathogens. Respiratory transmission is what we see with COVID-19 primarily, and other things like influenza, where somebody gets sick with a pathogen that focuses its attack on the lungs, and then when the infected person then coughs or sneezes, they eject droplets of fluid that contain that pathogen, and somebody else inhales them, and the pathogen establishes in the new host. And then the last one is vector-borne transmission, where the movement from one person to another is mediated, or one host to another is mediated by usually an insect, like a mosquito in the case of malaria or many viral diseases. There are other insects, particularly things like ticks, for example, in some cases flies, that can serve as vectors for infectious disease. Fleas is another one. That's how bubonic plague was primarily transmitted, is by infected fleas. So there are a number of important, historically, and in some cases currently, important vector-borne diseases. All right. So a lot of you, I think, are public health majors, so you're familiar with the field of epidemiology, but this is basically the study of patterns of, for our purposes, patterns of disease in a population. Epidemiology is really broader than that. It's lots of health issues that are studied, but we're focusing here on infectious disease epidemiology. So a couple of terms that I want you to remember. Morbidity is the rate of disease or illness in a population. So, for example, how many people are infected with COVID-19 in Santa Clara County, right? Well, should qualify that. Morbidity refers specifically to illness, so asymptomatic patients may not be included in that. There would be something more like an infection rate. But for a lot of diseases, we actually see them based on their symptoms, so that would be morbidity. So morbidity is equivalent to illness. Mortality is equivalent to the death rate of a disease in a population. So ultimately, infectious disease epidemiology wants to know as much as possible about how diseases spread, who's infected, how does it change over time, what do patterns of disease tell us about who's susceptible, or about mechanisms of transmission, etc. There's a lot of questions that you can ask in infectious disease epidemiology, right? So for the United States, it's the CDC is the main epidemiology body at the national level. The World Health Organization is the main institution globally that keeps track of infectious disease data. Sorry. All right. So just a little briefly about the history of epidemiology. The first sort of the father of epidemiology, or at least infectious disease epidemiology, is often considered to be John Snow, who was a physician in London in the middle part of the 19th century. And he focused for years on trying to understand cholera. And in 1854, there was a major outbreak in one particular neighborhood in London, the Soho neighborhood, that he had the idea to actually map out where infected people were and trying to understand what was actually causing this cholera outbreak. So this cholera outbreak, or cholera outbreaks in general, are what are called common source epidemics. So there's a single source of infection to which the population is exposed. I guess I wouldn't say that about all cholera outbreaks, but this particular one, it was. And so what John Snow was able to figure out is that essentially almost all of the people who were infected were geographically in this area shown here, and were getting their water from a pump that's roughly in the middle of this location, the Broad Street pump. And so he connected the cholera to a particular water source, which he believed was the cause of it. And there's a lot more to this story. Here is, if you're a microbiologist or an epidemiologist or a public health person and you're ever in London, a lot of people stop by the Broad Street pump. This is me there in 2010 when I was teaching in Denmark, and we did a little trip to London and happened to be in the area. So it was pouring rain when we were there, but that's the Broad Street pump, and it's a monument. Obviously, no one actually uses it for water anymore, so this is just a sort of a symbolic monument to John Snow. At any rate, this was, if you remember, the mid 1800s was before the work of Koch and Pasteur in sort of advancing the germ theory of disease and actually proving that specific bacteria were causing specific diseases. So John Snow didn't have the advantage of being able to take water samples and show that they were contained Vibrio cholerae, which is the cause of cholera. But he had the idea of, removing the handle for this pump so that people couldn't get it anymore. He eventually convinced the local government to do that. The epidemic stopped, but in fact, it was already slowing down. So it's not really clear that removing the pump definitively proved that it was responsible for the cholera outbreak. But there's been a lot of research since then on how the water got contaminated, where the first case was, etc. So the point is, this SNOW's sort of spatial mapping technique and trying to identify the cause of the disease was pretty revolutionary at the time. Cholera, unfortunately, is still with us. There was an outbreak in Haiti for several years. It's a pretty fascinating and tragic story of cholera being brought there by Nepalese peacekeepers. And several thousand people died in that outbreak. So it's still a fairly common disease globally, even though it's fairly easy to treat with antibiotics as well. All right, I'm going to stop there for this particular this recording.